Well, I'm Linda Seacrest. I'm the president of the RESET Center, and on behalf of all of my other RESET fellows, we'd like to welcome you to our first, but certainly not our last program. We look forward to many more of these. And the reason that I'm here today is because I've been writing about sustainability, healthy lifestyles for 17 years. Every year when it came time to write about Earth Day, I had to dig for information. I came here almost 3 years ago now when the waters were cleaner, there was less development, and it was just a different kind of place. Still is beautiful. As many of you who have probably been here for a long time, you have a touchstone, you have a memory of what things used to look like. So after all these years of writing about sustainability and interviewing many of the top people like Paul Hawken and Bill McKibben and Steve Gottlieb, who wrote the book From Greed to Green, I have had hope each time I read those books and each time I wrote the articles and posted them in Natural Awakenings. And that means that there were 30,000 people in our area who were reading them. I really, after so much time, I got tired of hoping because I did not see progress. And eventually, when my publisher asked me to write an article when it came time for Earth Day, I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that anymore because I can't find enough things to write about as far as progress goes for all that time. So I stopped doing that. We continued to put the ads in the magazine, but I stopped writing the articles. And eventually I thought to myself, a career of 17 years that is spent writing about something that I was really passionate about, when there's no progress, it's very disheartening, very disheartening. And so I decided, what else can I possibly do? I can get out from behind my pen and do something. And despite the fact that I am painfully introverted and really would rather run from speaking to people instead of being in front of them, I decided it was time to make a sacrifice. And that was to sacrifice for what is sustaining our lives now, which is Mother Earth. So Pachamama Alliance was my first go-to. And then eventually I ended up here with the RESET group. And as you look around your screen, you should see the RESET on here so you can identify. I believe that all of us are here today to greet you and welcome you to our first program. So I'd like to turn this over now to, I believe it's Carl Dygert.
Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome.
So I came to the Rights of Nature through a friend who took me to the concept. I've been coming to Florida since I was in diapers. I've lived in Florida for 26 years, and I've slowly, I watched Florida slowly die in front of me. So I had been asked to run for House of Representatives. I said yes. But once I discovered the expediency and the effectiveness that the Rights of Nature laws can bring to Florida, I decided to devote my time and energy to this. As a boat captain, as a waterfront motel owner in Lee County, my economic sustainability depends on this clean water, as the entire state of Florida does. Without it, I foresee an economic meltdown that will be unrivaled. So by creating these constitutionally framed laws in our local municipalities and at the county level, I believe we can bring the biggest polluters to the table and put them on put ourselves as people on an equal footing with the corporations to represent these ecosystems that are given rights. And through the rights of nature, we give ourselves also the rights to clean water and clean air that we currently do not have a legal right to. So that's how I came to this. I invited Thomas Linzey to host a workshop last July. We had quite an attendance. Several of those people are still here. Joe Benasia and Gary Robbins have picked up the torch and are doing mad work to bring rights of nature to Florida. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Linzey to explain the ins and outs and the complexities of the rights of nature and what it can mean for legal and what it can mean for all of Florida. Thank you all for your attendance, and I'd like to thank the Reset for hosting this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with folks today. I know we're probably tired of staring at screens. So we're trying to make this as interesting as we can. So greetings from smoky Washington State. I hail to you from the city of Spokane, where we currently have a smoke cover, which is going to last for another 3 days here, most likely, but it's hazardous air quality. And so if we're looking for environmental progress, especially on a climate front, not going to find it with the forest fires or the smoke that's over California, Oregon, and Washington State right now. So just as an introduction here, I'm an attorney for an organization known as the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. For the past 25 years, I was the co-founder and managed a team of about a dozen lawyers at an organization known as the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, or CELDEF for short. And left CELDEF last year to create this new organization, which is focused almost exclusively on advancing legally enforceable rights for nature in the US and also abroad. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what that work means, why we started doing that work, and how it's found purchase in Florida with the Florida Rights of Nature Network and this initiative, which we think is the most important ballot initiative on the November ballot in the United States in Orange County this year to recognize rights for the Wekiva, Conlock-Hatchie, and other waters of Orange County. And Chuck O'Neill, who's on this call, is going to present on the Orange County initiative and what it means and how it's come about and those types of things. So just to rewind a little bit back to 1995, which seems like ancient history at this point. But we created a nonprofit law firm in 1995 to do what I refer to lovingly now as conventional environmental enforcement work. So we appealed permits, we did land use plans, we filed lawsuits to enforce the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, you name it, we did it. Coming out of law school when we created the nonprofit law firm, we basically had framed the problem as not enough environmental lawyers enforcing the good environmental laws that we have in the United States today. And today we'd probably frame it as too many lawyers doing the work. But just to explain, at one point we were representing 100 different client organizations, mostly grassroots community groups in rural Pennsylvania, which is where we got our start. And so we were fighting everything from factory hog farms to fracking to pipelines to large-scale water withdrawals to wastewater injection plants. You name it, we had client organizations that we were representing on those issues to stop those projects and plans and buildings from coming into those municipalities. The problem is that as we were representing these groups in various permit appeals and other cases, that we would tend to win the first round of these things. Like with a permit appeal, you have a state agency that issues a permit to a corporation generally. The citizens group then comes in after the fact to challenge the permit that's been issued. Most of the time, a lot of times we would win the first round in front of the administrative law judge. We would find some gap, omission, or deficiency that the corporation had forgotten to put into their permit application. We would then argue in front of the judge that the permit never should have been issued because it didn't meet the regulatory requirements in terms of content for that to issue. The judge would generally agree with us, and the permit would be overturned or revoked for that particular project, which was great news. And then the community group would have a victory party. So we would go to the party and have some beer and snacks, and people would say, well, the system works. We were able to stop this frack wastewater injection well from coming into our community. We're not going to have it anymore. You know, we found a lawyer who could speak fairly intelligibly in front of the judge, and the judge agreed with us, and now we're not going to get this factory hog farm or whatever it was in the community. Well, what would happen next is really informed the next 20, 25 years of my activist life, at least, which was, as we all know, or folks who have worked in community organizing know, that the corporation just comes back and fills in the gaps, omissions, and deficiencies that the lawyers have identified as being deficient within the permit application. And so sometimes this process would go on for 10 or 20 rounds as the corporations would come back and continue to fill in the permit application stuff and eventually successfully get a permit issued. But make no doubt about it, the practice of environmental law in the United States today is built around that hamster wheel, which we came to recognize as kind of a whack-a-mole game, which is that communities come together. By the time a project comes in, it's almost bottom of the ninth inning because the corporations have already written the permit regulations under which the permits issue. And therefore, the community group comes in under a set of rules that they haven't written, that have been authored by the industry in that area, and essentially are faced with a losing proposition of continuing to fight, but against a well-financed corporation or business entity against them who has either written the regulations or are benefiting from those regulations. The question is, you know, our wins are few and far between, lasting wins. So we tend to get those ones in the beginning, but then not at all. So we watched as an African-American community in Pennsylvania got hit with the 9th chemical toxic waste incinerator that was proposed outside of Philadelphia. We fought factory farms, but then the corporations would simply go to the state legislature and change the regulatory rules under which we had won a temporary stop on factory farms from coming in. It got so bad in Pennsylvania that after we were successful in a lot of these first round permit appeals, that the state passed a law authorizing the Attorney General of the state to sue our municipalities, our cities and towns and townships that had fought these factory farms, for actually the Attorney General of the state to sue them in the name of the state to overturn the type of work that they were doing within the municipality to oppose these projects. So we came to the conclusion, and sometimes it's hard to admit and sometimes weird to say, but that environmental law doesn't actually protect the environment. We found that it's more of a process to shave off some of the rough edges of some of these projects, but it certainly isn't about stopping the projects. And it certainly isn't about communities having say over whether those projects actually come in or not, let alone a kind of veto. And it was at that point, 2000, 2001, that we had this kind of awakening about environmental law. And somebody much smarter than we were at the time talked about the structural inadequacies of environmental laws as practiced in the United States. And we at least thought we were costing the corporations money when they would come in and we would challenge a permit. They have to hire lawyers. We would fight it out over the permit. We were at least costing them money. It was at that point that we found out that the monies that the corporations spend defending their permits is tax deductible as a reasonable and necessary business expense under the tax law. So structurally, we weren't even costing them money for the lawyers because they could write it off as a business expense deductible under the tax law. And the other thing that someone said to me at that point in time, she said that the only thing that environmental regulations regulate is environmentalists, because they make us predictable as to how we fight. If we think that the industry who's writing the regulations in the first place is going to give us any space whatsoever to actually veto the projects that they're proposing when they're in charge of writing their own regulatory structures, we're the crazy ones, which is why, in my opinion, at least, things have gotten worse. Things are worse now 40 years after the major environmental laws were passed in the United States by almost every major environmental statistic, going back to what Linda said as well, in terms of trying to find progress, that we're worse now 40 years out than we were before those major environmental laws were passed by almost every major environmental statistic. So it was time to analyze, it was time to re-examine. We did it by quitting. We quit the regulatory system. We don't do permit appeals anymore. We don't do land use appeals. We don't enforce the Clean Air Act. We don't enforce the Clean Water Act. We don't do that stuff. What we do instead has shifted to having clients who are municipal governments and community organizations who are now making law, actually drafting law, making law, using their municipal platform to adopt law within their municipality. And the subject of those laws is generally recognizing legally enforceable rights for ecosystems, including rivers, waterways, bays, forests, watersheds, recognizing that something akin to human rights, because under our system of law, the highest level of recognition that we have to protect something along the lines of human freedom and the inviolate human space that we have as bodies against trespass and those types of things. When we want to recognize the highest values, we do it through rights. So we do it through human rights, a recognition of civil rights. Unfortunately, we've never done that for nature, except for recently in the work that I'm about ready to talk about. And that I think is very exciting. It's probably the most exciting stuff that's happened, at least from an activist standpoint, from my standpoint in the last 30 years, this is the most exciting stuff. It is the new frontier of environmental law. And so a lot of people talk about rights of nature. What is it? Where does it come from? When we give talks, we trace it back to indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have always had a much different relationship with nature than Western communities. And it's a difference that is most evident when you talk to tribes. So we represent tribes as clients across the United States. And so their language is much different, whereas Western culture treats nature as a thing, a piece of property in essence to be used. Indigenous communities talk about it more in terms of being a person. So it's kind of like property versus rights, this Western versus indigenous. And there's a real collision between these two value systems, the indigenous value systems and the Western value system, in that nature in one system is for use. In the other system, you find something more animated, living. It's almost like a dead system of nature. That's how the Western system treats it, versus a living system of nature, which is how indigenous communities treat it. And so when you're talking to the Ponca Nation in Oklahoma, they talk about speaking for those without voices. And when you talk to the White Earth Nation in Minnesota, they talk about the flying people and the swimming people and the singing people. So an animated version, a perspective of nature. And the Yurok in Northern California, which recently recognized the Klamath River as having rights, talk about the Klamath River being a living being. So contrast that to the Western system of law. Sir Francis Bacon once infamously said that we needed to torture nature on a rack to learn her secrets. And so the difference between the two couldn't be even further apart. So building on that indigenous understanding of nature, back in the early 1970s, a law professor named Christopher Stone wrote a pretty groundbreaking piece called "Should Trees Have Standing?" It was a law review article that he wrote that posited that natural objects, what some people refer to as resources, should have rights in court. That instead of the Sierra Club or another organization speaking in the name of or taking the place of an ecosystem, with a valley that's being developed or a forest that's being destroyed, that the forest itself or the valley should be the plaintiff in those cases, that the ecosystem itself should be not represented by human organizations or environmental groups, but actually be the plaintiff themselves to defend their own rights in these cases rather than be dependent upon environmental organizations. And this thing called standing, where you have to show that if you're going to go to court on an environmental issue, you have to show that you personally have been injured or have some kind of harm to you personally that's been caused. And over the past 20 years, not to get into the weeds on standing, but a lot of environmental groups have been thrown out of court because they can't show injury, whereas the ecosystem can, because the ecosystem is what's being destroyed. So real groundbreaker, this "Should Trees Have Standing" by Christopher Stone led a lot of people to start thinking differently about stuff. It led us to our first client, municipal client in Pennsylvania, Tamaqua Borough, who was threatened with some toxic waste dumping in the municipality. And we assisted that municipality become the first one in the world and on the globe to pass an ordinance recognizing rivers and streams within the municipality as having rights, and specifically the rights to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. So those were the substantive rights that accrued to those ecosystems within that municipality. And it's important to understand these laws, which we'll talk about in detail a little bit later, but they have three components to them. One, a recognition of rights, so moves nature from being a thing to being a person in some ways, then recognizes substantive rights for those ecosystems, and then recognizes the right of community residents to stand in the shoes of the ecosystems to defend them against harm, and then has a restoration clause where damage has to be fixed as a result of a violation of the local law that has occurred. And the Tamacua Borough stuff really opened the door to Ecuador, which a lot of people have heard about. We were called down to Ecuador to be a consultant to the National Constitution Drafting Assembly. And we shared stories of Tamacua. They had already heard about Tamacua, so that's how small the world was and is, which is a small municipality in Pennsylvania, ended up on the desks of constitutional delegates in Ecuador who were rewriting the national constitution. And Ecuador became the first country in the world to actually take what we refer to as a property-based system of environmental protection and shift and transform it into a rights-based system of environmental protection. Very exciting time. Drafts went into the national constitution. We were there to watch the process and share stories and participate in the drafting. And eventually Ecuador adopted that new constitution overwhelmingly, becoming the first country in the world to actually drive this rights-based concept for nature into the national constitution. And then even more exciting is that there were a couple test cases in which the judges actually held in favor of the ecosystem. So it kind of twists our brains, but the first test case was a river that filed suit as a plaintiff against a local government to stop an environmentally destructive project, and the judge ruled in favor of the river, the Vilcabamba River, which was the plaintiff. So kind of stretches our brains. So Ecuador happened, then it came back to the US on a boomerang kind of thing with attention and publicity. The city of Pittsburgh, we assisted to draft a rights of nature law. They are the most well-known municipality at this point that has passed a rights of nature ordinance. And then to our surprise, moving from these legal or law enactments, courts began to pick up on the rights of nature. So in Colombia in 2016, Indian courts in 2017, Colombian courts in 2018, Uganda and Bangladesh courts and legislatures in 2019 began to issue court rulings, not based on laws, but based on the concept that what Ecuador had passed, this rights of nature concept, was becoming an emerging norm of international environmental law. So without any legislation passed, courts and judges began to move on their own, which was extremely exciting because it has spread from those early decisions in Colombia and India out to these other courts. There's a very important set of court cases in Ecuador right now, which will define what rights of nature within the Ecuadorian Constitution means for specific preserves, biological reserves in Ecuador and other parts of the country. So that's very important also. And then to finish up, just to give an idea about the extent of how far these have traveled, I mentioned that a lot of our clients are tribes, and tribal nations have also begun taking the rights of nature concepts and integrating them into tribal constitutions and tribal laws. They include the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin, the Ponca in Oklahoma, the Ojibwe, Chippewa, the White Earth Nation in Minnesota, the Menominee in Wisconsin, and the most recent one, which is the Yurok tribe in California. So all extremely exciting stuff. I think this is the new frontier of environmental law. The Ecuadorian work would not have happened without the Pachamama Alliance. Bill Twist with Pachamama was one of the movers and shakers in Ecuador that brought us in to speak to the Constitutional Assembly there. And so it's kind of a small world in the number of people who are doing this kind of work. So the most exciting stuff to us at this point is Florida. I think Florida is right now the epicenter of rights of nature work with this Orange County initiative that's occurring. And I was thinking back to my first conversation with Chuck O'Neill, who's on the call, and we'll talk about the Orange County initiative next. But the work in Florida is only about a year old, little older than a year, but it's the fastest that this work has moved anywhere in the United States. And it's the biggest municipality because as Orange County, I think it's 1.5 million, something like that, in degree, it is by large the largest local government to take on the rights of nature. And a lot of that is thanks to Chuck O'Neill. So I wanted to introduce Chuck now. Chuck sent me a 2-page bio. He's done a lot more than what I'm going to say right now, but he ran for the Florida Senate in 2016, served as the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee and as first vice president of the League of Women Voters of Florida. He led the League's participation in Florida's Water and Land Legacy Constitutional Amendment, which was known as State Amendment 1. He's also the author of one of the early drafts of the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. He wrote the Black Bear Habitat Restoration Act, which was introduced in both the Florida House and the Senate. And currently he serves as a director of the Florida Rights of Nature Network, and is currently leading the effort to pass Orange County's Right to Clean Water Initiative, or what's known as Charter Amendment 1 in his home county of Orange. So I'm going to turn it over to Chuck at this point.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Carl, and especially thank you to Linda and the Reset Center for listening to us. And what we are talking about today may come as a big surprise to groups who have been fighting this fight for decades. What we're doing here is the recognition that something is not working. As Thomas mentioned, I worked with Senator Simmons on the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act, which was a really good bill before it left Orlando and went to Tallahassee. I call Tallahassee the heart of darkness, because that is where good bills go to die. And what happened with that bill, I think, happens with almost every good piece of environmental legislation in the state. It arrives in Tallahassee and it is instantly picked apart by the lobbyists for groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce, Associated Industries of Florida, Florida Farm Bureau, the major players up in Tallahassee. And then anything that could possibly impact their bottom line is stripped from the bill. Words such as shall are turned into may. You have things like that. So growing up, as Linda said, moving here, as we all did at some point before this call, Florida was always better. I grew up swimming in Wekiva Springs. It was crystal clear blue water with a white sandy bottom. And now the bottom is covered with algae and the water is green. And there are just not the same amount of fish or wildlife along the river. So I don't need to tell you about rivers. You have the Calusa down there. And when Linda was talking about how different it is today from what it was, I think, what if Thomas Edison were to come back to Fort Myers and look at it today? I mean, it was such a tropical paradise when he moved there, and he moved there because of the abundance of flora and fauna. And what's happened just over the course of decades, really over the course of decades in a state that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. And now we have this horrible problem. So how do we turn things around? As Thomas said, I was the chair of the Natural Resource Committee for the League of Women Voters of Florida. And I got so frustrated with the way the system works. I went to a seminar 5 or 6 years ago. Thomas was speaking. So it stuck in my mind. I said, this is just a way too radical idea for Florida. Floridians will never accept this. Never, never, never. And then I got to a point, I said, look, this is our last hope. This is our last hope. I do not say that lightly. I've seen everything tried in this state. Amendment 1, we thought was going to restore funding to the Florida Forever program. No, it didn't. It gets turned around. Even state amendments get turned around. So when we concentrate on the local level, like we're doing here in Orange County, we're changing laws from the bottom up. We're amending the charter of Orange County. And how do you do that? There are 3 ways that you can amend the charter, just like you have a charter in Lee County. You can do it through a petition, an initiative, where you have to get tens of thousands of petitions signed. I think you have to get over 40,000 in Lee County. In Orange County, it's about 100,000. The second way is to get the county commission to agree to put something on the ballot. The problem with that is a lot of times the county commission is controlled by the same interests that are shaping the laws in Tallahassee. Maybe on a smaller level, but they are very much controlled. So the third method, and the method we went, is the charter review process. Every 4 years in Orange County, citizens can come in and propose things to be put into the charter. So we went through this charter review process. It was voted on, sent to a committee. That committee met on it for 7 months. We had 11 meetings. The proposal was torn apart, put back together, torn apart, put back together. And what we have right now is actually on the ballot for November 3rd. And I'll just read to you what it says. And this is what voters are going to be voting on November 3rd in Orange County. The title is Prohibiting Pollution of the Wekiva River, Econ-Lockhatchee River, and all other waters of Orange County. And the summary is amending the charter by providing charter protections for the natural rights of the Wekiva and Econ-Lockhatchee rivers and all other waters of Orange County by prohibiting pollution, providing a definition of waters, providing a private right of action and standing for citizens of Orange County to enforce these protections against governmental agencies, non-natural persons, or corporate entities that intentionally or negligently pollute the waters, and providing severability and exceptions. Now, the severability part is important because as we were going through this process, the legislature got wind of it. And of course, if it's anything good and it's anything that might even work to help nature, it had to be quashed. So they developed a bill. It went through the House, was sailing through the House and got in the Senate. It started getting tied up in the Senate. A preemption bill, a bill to stop any local government from granting rights of nature to water bodies. So this bill that got slowed down in the Senate was plucked out and then inserted into Senate Bill 712, which is the Clean Waterways Act. And it's hundreds of lines of verbiage. Right in the middle, they stuck this preemption in. Well, the preemption does not stop both parts of the bill because there's a rights of nature part, and then there's also a second part that says all citizens of Orange County have a right to clean water by having the waters of Orange County protected against pollution. And that is what we call the right to clean water in Orange County. We have worked around, and our message has worked around the preemption that was passed and signed into law in SB 712. So where do we go from here? You know, we're less than 50 days away from the election. We have about 2,000 signs that have been printed that are out. We have a Facebook page called the Right to Clean Water. We have a website, righttocleanwater.com. We have shot commercials with local government officials endorsing this charter amendment, and we're running those in social media. And we have an active campaign reaching out to the community, which Orange County is a very diverse community. There's a large Hispanic population and a large Black population, as well as both extremes of the political spectrum. But what it boils down to in the end, and what I tell people and reporters I talk to, is how are you going to fight this? How is a lobbyist group going to fight this? Because you have to convince people that pollution is good, that it's better for them to drink polluted water than it is to drink clean water, and that cancer is a figment of the imagination, and it's not produced by all these different toxins that are in our waterways and that our kids are drinking. So we have high hopes that we will prevail in November. And if you'd like more information about what we're doing here, please go to the righttocleanwater.com, or you can also join our Facebook group, which is Florida Rights of Nature Network. And I'd welcome you to join on there. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Thomas, who's going to talk about the work that's been going on with Estero Bay. Thomas?
Thanks, Chuck. So I know for folks that this is a new concept too. This is like probably trying to drink from a fire hose because it's a lot of stuff. But the basic tenet here is that it is a new approach that's grounded in very old value systems. That when we talk to municipalities, sometimes we describe it as crashing into a Western system of law with an indigenous value system. That we're actually attempting to change the system of law that currently exists because we can't survive. It's like a suicide pact. To have a Western system of law that we're living under that allows and encourages and even accelerates the destruction of the earth. That's the Western system of law that we're stuck in. And to tell us that the best we can do is try to regulate the rate at which nature is destroyed, which is at least in my past, the time the regulatory system operates the best, the most you can expect from the environmental regulatory system that we have is that it regulates the rate at which we destroy the planet. But it's not a question of do we destroy the planet, it's a question of what the rate is for that through that environmental regulatory system. I also want to say that Orange is not alone. There are 36 other communities, smaller communities across the United States that have passed rights of nature laws, recognizing legally enforceable rights for ecosystems. And the idea, which was on the radical fringe, I think 10 years ago, we first started working on it 15, 17 years ago, has gained a lot of credence at this point. It's not so crazy anymore. The University of Florida Law School held a Rights of Nature conference that the Florida Rights of Nature Network participated in and helped structure the content for. The Florida Democratic Party platform now has a Rights of Nature plank in it, in addition to the 2016 National Democratic Party platform, which also had a Rights of Nature plank in it, supporting indigenous communities' movement towards recognizing rights of nature. And in addition to the Levin College of Law at the University of Florida, which hosted the Rights of Nature conference, we've also helped Tulane Law School and Vermont Law School host similar conferences around rights of nature. So it's gaining credence, and it also helps that one of the leading authors of the Clean Water Act in the United States, Professor Oliver Houck, who's at Tulane, has now come out as a big supporter of rights of nature legal frameworks, basically saying survival is impossible under this old system of environmental regulatory stuff. So back to Florida, a lot of people ask, well, Senate Bill 712 has passed and was signed by the governor, and this was the bill that preempts municipalities, us people, from adopting rights of nature laws within their own cities, towns, and counties. Well, isn't this all over for Florida then, because the state legislature has spoken? Well, the answer is no, for two reasons. Number one, the rights of nature movement in the United States and the folks doing this work have begun to openly challenge the authority of the state legislature to prohibit municipalities from recognizing more stringent environmental standards at the municipal level. And in fact, in Florida, a lawsuit's been filed by Speak Up Okaiva, the Florida Rights of Nature advocates, against the state to actually begin to try to limit the state's authority in attempting to preempt what municipalities can or cannot pass in terms of heightened environmental standards within the state. We think that's the next battleground, is about constraining the state's authority to preempt. Because after all, in Florida, which has been one of the most active states in preemption over plastic straw bans and banning certain kinds of sunscreen and plastic bag bans, and it goes into all kinds of stuff like rent control, and preemption is bigger than just environmental issues, that unless you can constrain the state legislature from doing this stuff, that it becomes a privatized body for the major industries in Florida to simply prevent you from protecting your own health, safety, and welfare at the local level. So the first thing is limiting that state preemptive effect, which is essential. And the second piece is that we've taken the preemption law that was passed, Senate Bill 712, and actually drafted local ordinances around it. And when I say going around it, Orange County's initiative has some seeds of what we've now used to draft a new set of ordinances that evades Senate Bill 712's preemptive effect. So even assuming that the legislature has the power to pass these preemptive laws, and even assuming that Senate Bill 712 is effective and valid, which we don't think it is, but assuming that it is, we've drafted a new set of ordinances that actually evades the preemptive effect of Senate Bill 712 and allows people to continue to do lawmaking at the municipal level to adopt what in essence are rights of nature laws, but just which use slightly different language. And we don't have to get into the weeds on some of this stuff unless folks want to pick it up and take the template that we drafted around Estero Bay. For this particular call, we looked at Fort Myers Beach and the potential for people within Fort Myers Beach to do an initiative campaign to place something on the ballot which would recognize certain rights for Estero Bay, basically doing it through a frame of a right to clean water for people, which also recognizes that Estero Bay must have certain abilities, like the ability to exist, flourish, and regenerate. So using some of the same standards, just playing around with some words, but getting around the Senate Bill 712 preemption so that these ordinances can continue to be passed, because at least in our opinion, until 200 municipalities or 100 municipalities in a given state pass these kinds of laws, you don't have the pressure from below that actually presses into that state legislative change that has to take place as well. So when we talk about these laws, we're talking about more than laws. We're talking about a revolt. I mean, just to be very clear here, we're talking about a systems change, a structural change in how the law treats nature and ecosystems. It's not just the ink on the page. The beauty is not just typing out what these laws are or getting them qualified. We're talking about an entire sea change about how we see the world in which we live and how we relate with that world, and who becomes the heroes, the advocates, putting and strengthening them into a different position than what they're in now within this environmental regulatory whack-a-mole kind of model. And so there's good news in all of this, which is that number one, it evidences the beginning to us of this structural sea change in the way that we treat and see nature, which absolutely has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we're doomed. As a species, we're dooming the planet. This is it kind of thing, going back to what Chuck said about options. And second of all, the fact that the Florida legislature had to actually start writing a preemption bill and passing it. It's funny, sometimes on our side of the line, progressive groups poo-poo rights of nature stuff, but yet the opponents of rights of nature know exactly how powerful it is, because they're the ones writing the preemptive bills at the state level to stop you in your own municipalities from adopting them. So even though our allies sometimes don't understand the reach of this stuff or the effectiveness of it, the effectiveness is proven by the other side about how hard they're working to stop you from doing it. That's the proof. The proof is in the pudding. So again, for this call, working with Carl and Joe and Gary, we drafted a template ordinance for the Estero Bay. It's built on the work that we did for Pensacola Bay and customizing a template for a protection of the Estero Bay, essentially as part of an effort if one decides to emerge in Fort Myers Beach to protect Estero Bay. But you can do the same for the Caloosahatchee River, et cetera, other ecosystems in the county or in southwestern Florida. And just to end this particular segment, again, these laws have three components to them. One is a recognition of rights, and in the Orange Initiative, it's explicit recognition of the right to keep clean water. Basically a recognition that for people to have a right to clean water, you have to have clean waterways. So there's a rights section. The second section is who can enforce these rights. And there's a citizen suit enforcement provision in there that says if you're a resident of the community, you can stand in the shoes of the ecosystem to bring a legal action. So it's not just begging and pleading elected officials or governments to do the enforcement. It's actually releasing enforcement out to community members who care enough about the ecosystem to actually step in and enforce the rights and the other provisions of the law. And third, there's a restoration provision which says, what's the remedy if you step into the shoes of the ecosystem to sue? Well, the remedy is that the ecosystem has to be restored back to its status before the violation occurred. So basically cleaning it up to the place it was before the law was broken and the rights were violated, rights of the ecosystem were violated. So that's where it leaves us in terms of these ordinances, evading preemption, getting around them so that these ordinances can continue. But we're dedicated to working with the Florida Rights of Nature Network and folks in southwestern Florida to design these ordinances and do whatever we can to help support them and move them forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl, back to Carl, so you can talk a little bit about Lee-Ron and Cowboy and all the good stuff that they've been doing.
Thank you, Thomas. So just as a local example of what's been discussed here, we have Cape Coral who wants to remove a barrier called the Chiquita Lock. So as the Matlacha Civic Association, which I was the president of, we challenged that permit issuance. We won, but they're coming again. So they now know the defects that we defeated them on. So they're going to go back and correct it, and they're going to come again. And that's the way this works. And they'll come again till they run us out of money or patience or what have you. But that's just a local example. The Chiquita Lock removal is a local example of how the economic actors will eventually succeed in a traditional environmental scenario. I'm the treasurer of Lee County Rights of Nature, so I get to ask you for your support. But it's not only financial support. We ask that you involve us with your own nonprofits. Bring the nonprofits together to work together to fight the same fight and achieve the same goals. So we ask you that you introduce us to your groups, and beyond your nonprofits, your local civic groups, your churches, your schools. We need our foot in the door everywhere we can get it, because I like to say that I'm the campaign manager for RON, Rights of Nature. This parallels a political campaign. We need name recognition, we need to build a base, we need citizen support, and we need funding to make this happen. In regards to funding, you can visit cleanwater2020.org to help support that Orange County initiative, because you're not just helping Orange County, but the Rights of Nature movement across the nation, here in Lee County and everywhere else, because Orange County is going to make history on November 3rd. And we would like everybody to be part of that. So the Lee County Rights of Nature, we have a Facebook page. You can follow us there. So here in Lee County, what are we doing? Thomas talked about Estero Bay last July when we came out of our workshop. We were all excited, but we needed 44,000 signatures, and they only give you 6 months to do that. It's one of the ways they control us. We've pulled back from a county initiative, and we're focusing on the municipalities within Lee County. Fort Myers Beach can do this, but just 500, 600 signatures. We can do that at the Sandcastle Festival to make this happen, to get this on the ballot in Lee County. Sanibel can do this with 700 signatures. So we feel as each municipality adopts these rights of nature laws, then we can go for the big one, and we can get this done countywide for the Calusa River. So again, I'd like to thank Reset, Pachamama, and everybody for attending today.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everybody. And I just want to say, it is really a big deal that the Pachamama Alliance, a global organization, has decided to take on supporting the rights of nature. Because one of the very first questions asked here in the chat, and I think I want to ask it to you, Thomas, is, wasn't it the Achuar tribe and the work that John Palmer and Bill and Lynn Twist did? Did they work with you in Ecuador? And isn't this how the Pachamama Alliance got started, by this Rights of Nature initiative?
Yeah, so it was kind of a perfect storm. At that point, the Pachamama Alliance had formed prior to that, and Fundación Pachamama, which is their equivalent chapter in Ecuador, had also been formed. The main moving factor here was Bill Twist. Bill was an acquaintance of a guy named Alberto Acosta, who was the former Minister of Mines for the country of Ecuador. And Correa, who was the president of Ecuador at the time, put Alberto Acosta in as president of the Constitutional Assembly. And so when I got the call from Bill, because the call came from Bill, asking me to come down, it was to meet with Alberto and to actually use their staff to then meet with the committees that were doing the actual drafting for the Constitutional Convention. So Bill was with us every step of the way. Natty Green was and is still one of the primary movers and shakers of rights of nature in Ecuador. It wouldn't have happened without her, but she's part of Fundación Pachamama as well. So a bunch of threads, but that's how it all came together in the end.
That's really exciting. That feels like a full circle to us here in South Florida. Okay, I think I do have another question that came up. Really, it's a comment and a question, and a few of you addressed it in the chat. This came from Patty Duncan. For all, why can't organizations such as the Sierra Club, et cetera, come together as one to support environmental candidates to both county and state and national office? Until we come together as one and back environmental counties, it's going to continue to be a whack-a-mole.
You know, I'm a realist. I have been involved with environmental organizations for a long time. And I realize that they each have their own view of what works. And I would not disagree with the Sierra Club or anything, but it's kind of like the 8 blind men and the elephant, right? One of them's grabbing the trunk and it's like a tree. And then the other's grabbing the ear and says, no, it's not a tree, it's a leaf. Well, what Thomas has showed us, in my opinion, is he turned the lights on for a lot of us. And then we step back, oh, it's an elephant. Okay, now we can see that we're dealing with an elephant. And as he said, the whack-a-mole, it's exhausting. It's exhausting for all of us and all of our groups because they can create more bad projects faster than we can fight them. And they depend on the fact that we consent to a process that minimizes our voices. I mean, my most hated word in the world is stakeholder. Okay, we're going to get a stakeholder group together, and one of the 10 people is going to represent 99% of the public. All right, and then this one's going to represent this industry, this. So the system is broken, and the only way I can see to fix it is to turn on that light and recognize that it's an elephant, but that light comes on at different times for different people.
I have a question from Ted Brown. How will climate change impact how this initiative progresses? Maybe Thomas, you want to address that?
Yes, I'll take a shot at it. Over the past couple of years, communities have begun talking about a right to climate and a right of climate and what that means. And the first entity to really enter the fray in taking rights of nature approach to climate issues was the city of Lafayette, Colorado, led by a woman named Marilee Matza, who was on our board of directors for a while. She pioneered a right to climate ordinance that passed the city council in Lafayette, Colorado. The intent of that is to recognize that not only people have a right to a livable climate, but also the ecosystems have a right to a livable climate, and then make that actionable. In other words, bring the lawyers in, sue the entities that are interfering with that right. And a lot of that work was kind of on the fringe until a judge in Oregon a couple years ago actually recognized a right to livable climate as a fundamental constitutional right under the US Constitution. It was part of the Children's Trust lawsuit in Oregon. And that opened up a whole new area, because then you had a federal judge making a determination that a right to a livable climate was actually a basic fundamental human right protected by the 5th and 14th Amendments to the US Constitution. So it fell into the same category as a right to privacy or a right to gay marriage, and into that category. That case has since gone down the tubes, but her decision remains, which is a finding of this right. So what we did was we took her language from that federal court decision and reinserted it back into the ordinance work. Because even though climate stuff has to be tackled nationally and globally, there's been a real failure to do so. I don't think that comes as news to anybody on this call. And to us, that's only going to change from a grassroots perspective that moves climate change as part of this rights of nature movement, and then melds the two together to actually give birth to a movement from below that's actually got real teeth on climate issues. And from the perspective of the Orange Initiative, if the Little Wekiva River has a right to exist, yet climate change is interfering with that right to exist, then it gives birth to a legally enforceable claim against actors who are interfering with that right to exist. We were special counsel to the Maldives for a year, helping the Attorney General for the country to fashion a right to livable climate into the national constitution for the Maldives, and then to use that as a platform to begin suing the major polluters around the globe, utilities and countries and everything else. I think that project, which never got past first couple steps, could be picked up again and moved if folks wanted to work on climate issues in a different way. A lot of our folks are done begging and pleading elected officials to do shit. That kind of pressure politics they're done with, because it has proven to be so ineffective. And so they're now moving to hijack, in some ways, these municipal platforms to put a new system of law in place. And I think that's why we have to understand that this is more than just about putting a law in the books. It's actually about changing the way the entire system works and how the structure functions and how we see nature and our role as activists, especially in terms of climate change.
You know, it seems like we always anthropomorphize our arguments. It seems like it's always a human-centered argument. And we talk about suing people because we're not entitled to certain rights. But continuing the thought line that was addressed earlier, by what right do we allocate ourselves the right to mute and muzzle nature's voice? Why do we allow ourselves to commandeer that right? And then following through with that, nature is raising its voice. That's what we're experiencing. Nature is running out of patience and raising its voice. And that's how we might be able to view the climate change issue. And it will be recalibrated whether we like it or not, because nature is expressing itself. So we should be able to provide a conduit to allow nature to express itself, or we'll be on the receiving end of a lot of sorrow and harm.
Thank you for inviting me to come today. My name is Bob Bunting. I'm a climate scientist. I used to run the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. It's about 1,000 scientists from around the world that work there. The first climate models to predict the climate change were made in the 80s when I was a director and executive vice president of that institution. Today it has over $400 million being spent on atmospheric research. So it's not all bad news. The United States leads the world in climate science, like it does in so many things. But we have failed to seize our advantage. And I'm not really sure what it will take, but what I know from, I was also the lead forecaster for NOAA. My expertise was in hurricanes forecasting, a very hot topic right now. So I just want to say that after working in those areas for decades, I can say to you that one of our views about how we do things, in my view, is totally off base, just like Thomas was saying in his field, but we cannot expect the government to lead the people. The people lead the government. And so the reason why we've had so little movement, even though we have so much knowledge, is because we're waiting for someone else to do it. And so my new center in Sarasota is called the Climate Adaptation Center, is looking at Florida and specifically the west coast of Florida. And it's taking global climate change and parsing all the science that's been done into language that everyone can understand and use to make informed decisions. And it's not about one side against the other. It's about us. We're all human beings. We all live in this world and we all drink clean water and we have a lot in common. We don't have that much not in common. That we have in common. And I think at our cellular level, we all care about being able to have a good world to live in. I mean, look at these fires this year across not just the United States, but the world, Australia, the United States, et cetera. So it's not one side against the other, and we should stop talking about it that way, because we're never going to get from black and white to gray, where the answer is, unless we stop talking about the politics of climate change. Climate is a science, it is not politics. And we need to put the sectors together, the academic sector, the private sector, and the government sector. So together we can forge new mitigation and adaptation strategies for Florida, especially, which is ground zero, in my opinion, for climate change, because it's so important that we make global climate change local, because the local is going to drive the climate economy, and the climate economy is going to get all these people who think they have other financial interests out of the way. I think the climate economy is going to be the #1 growing economy in Florida and in the world over the next 25 years. So we have a hopeful future, but we have to change the way we think about these things. And this is what's impeding us, not that we don't know and not that we don't have answers. There are plenty of answers. There are hundreds and hundreds of them we could implement right now if we had the will to do it.
Thank you. Everything that you just spoke is why we've created the Reset Center here as well, because we know that we need to all work together.
Well, it's such a privilege to listen to all of you folks, many of whom I've had a chance to work with and learn from. And I kind of oozed out the back door of a lot of the activist things until this crowd got me back in through Pachamama and the trigger of having known Paul Hawken through quite a few years. And when that Drawdown book came out, it kind of was a whack on the side of the head. It did such a good job of building the case for those 70 or possibly 100 different initiatives and building a business case for it as well as the environmental case, that if those things could be implemented on a conservative level, within 35 to 40 years, we could reverse the human impacts on global warming and sea level rise. And working with students, Tom triggered an insight. Every one of my ecology classes, I'd always start with bringing them outside. Everybody picks up a rock and they have to decide whether that rock's alive or not. Then we vote on it, a la the Bush administration science. We vote on whether it's alive or not. I'd say 95% to 99% vote that it's not alive. It's an inanimate object. And then their homework assignment is, all right, if you voted yes, or you voted no, or you didn't vote, if you choose not to vote, then the highest grade you'll get in this class is a C as a non-participant. And the point being to get them to take a perspective on the idea that what's perceived as an inanimate object could well be alive, as many of the indigenous people see it. And I think that's part of the job of we educators, to open up and break down some of the biases of the Cartesian world, the biases that create those laws we have right now. So what is this reset thing? And why do we need another organization? My goodness, there's so many of us. Well, during the 60s and 70s, we had an organization in Lee County called the Lee County Conservation Forum. And it was all the organizations, at that time, about 6 of us, who would get together and share, what are you doing? How can we help one another? Kind of what Patty was talking about, but more informational. And I got hooked up with these other 9 people that are the founders and kind of elders of although we have some not so elders, in this 10-person leadership group. And we said, what can we do? We all have these tremendous experiences. We have connections from global to local. We're all different. It's the most eclectic group I've ever been in. And the talents are just unbelievable. And in thinking about it, one of the roles that seemed to emerge was we have an opportunity to use the opportunity we've had to share with others and bring people together and create a forum and a place where people can share information, particularly, and ideas, and collaborate on projects together, all those who might want to work together, which doesn't mean everybody by any means at any given time, sharing that information, and as I say, resources as well. And the way we looked at that was, if we formed this little reset group, our job is to collaborate and pull people together of any organizations, businesses, and we don't want to keep it to just organizations. We want businesses involved. We want charitable groups involved. We want churches involved, and to create a focus on a few key things to start with. So the 3 things we picked of interest to us right now, and the one we did today was to start this conversation on a larger level, to educating all of ourselves better on what the issues were and what the background is on rights of nature. And I think I know I learned more stuff that was important today, Tom, particularly from you. I served 2 terms on the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board when we fought through the 90s to get the rights of water allocations for the environment. And we got it passed, but then, as you say, when they did the rulemaking, they circumvented it pretty much, and water got what the environment got what was ever left. We also think it's really important to do demonstration projects. Some of the members of our TENSUM have been funding local grassroots projects to get them started. Fred started that Climate Action Fund in the Community Foundation. And seed projects are a way to spread ideas. And I think that's something that's very important that a little group like this can help work with and direct resources to from contacts that we have, and that other people in other organizations, once they hear about what one group needs, might be able to help them find a connection. And then the third kind of thing, the second of our interests was regenerative agriculture. Agriculture is that we all want to eat. Food is absolutely critical to produce, but the way we've produced it needs to change. And agribusiness knows that. The change is rapid now. That's happening in grassroots, from your local backyard to subscription agriculture, to organics, to hydroponics, to mariculture, and aquaculture. All of those things are going on in this area right now. I can talk to people at U.S. Sugar, or whether it's the larger growers from my contact days at the Water Management District, and to be able to bring that cross-section together to talk about how do we grow and distribute food. We've seen the crisis in the pandemic of the growers producing food and having no market for it, but willing to give it away. But then the distribution centers, like Harry Chapin, is willing to give it away, but how do you get it from the field to the distribution centers? So those are problems that by putting people together, we can help solve. And that's a very active one right now in Southwest Florida. We decided we wanted to stay bioregional. So we want to focus our effort on the 5 Southwest Florida counties. Doesn't mean we're not interested in bringing resource people in from elsewhere or going elsewhere to look at ideas, but we want to focus on the grassroots and the politics of the 5 Southwest Florida counties. And our primary interest is staying focused on that human dimension of climate change contributions. So global warming, the human dimensions of global warming, which is what Hawken addressed in Drawdown, E.O. Wilson addressed in his latest book, Half Earth, and then also to look at regenerative and restorative ecology. And resilience ecology, I was with Casey today, and how do you restore an Orange River? How do you restore a Billy's Creek? How do you restore the creeks into Estero Bay that have outstanding water designations, but no protection? From FGCU all the way down to those creeks, from Lehigh Acres to those creeks, that's where the water's coming from. And all of the inflows from those have resilted Estero Bay to the point where it's choking itself to death. So that's our notion. And the demonstration projects, since some of our members have relationships with the Universalist Church down off Shire Rhine, they have this fantastic facility there with about a little over 25 acres. And there are raised bed gardens they've been doing for years. They have a beautiful forest, a hydric forest area. They have the areas they were doing ag in. They have an amphitheater. They have a hall that'll hold 400 people, and because the symphony has made an arrangement with them to share those facilities. They're upgrading the facilities so that we can do streaming online conferences like this. They have classrooms so we can do workshops there. So they have all those kind of opportunity resources that we'd like to work with them and partner with, and we can help supply some of the funding to upgrade their facilities for their own members as well as for the community at large. FGCU has committed to working with us on putting a food forest that Fred Moon has been working with them on. We're kind of laying out an area. We have a landscape architect doing a master plan for how we can make all this happen. And some of the ag people have already said they'll come down and do demonstrations and work with us. And the resilience ecology, I've got a group of about 20 people now on my core list of resilience-oriented people, some of whom were on the call today, including one of my former students, Lance Gunderson at Emory Universities, who's one of the top 5 or 6 resilience ecologists in the world, who worked with Howard Odom at University of Florida, did the Big Cypress study, became the science director for the Everglades National Park, and he was the chair of the committee that did the first Everglades restoration plan. That was the grandfather of what we're trying to implement today. So in a nutshell, that's what it's about. We want to be just a simple resource that some of us saw as a nest to incubate ideas, and some of us see it as a hub where the ideas can come together. But that's the idea that the 10 of us would like to serve. We can give at this stage of our careers back to the rest of you. And I think that kind of sums up.
I just want to formally, on behalf of the Reset Center and the Rights of Nature, to thank you all so much for coming, to thank Thomas Linzey, to thank Chuck O'Neill, to thank you, Carl, and every single one of you for all the work that you do for clean water, for clean air, and a more just, sustainable, and spiritually fulfilling presence on the planet. This is our mission. It's a big mission, but we can do it if we work together as organizations as well as people. So thank you all so much.